A police officer struck Ronda Rousey with his baton, but within seconds he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The late afternoon sun bathed the park in a golden glow, its rays piercing through the thick canopy of oak and maple trees. The scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers lingered in the air, blending with the distant laughter of children and the rhythmic chirping of birds. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, offering brief moments of relief from the warmth of the summer day. Joggers moved along the winding trails, their steady footsteps familiar against the paved paths. Families sprawled on blankets, sharing sandwiches and stories, while a group of teenagers played catch near the playground, their joyous shouts rising above the ambient hum of the park's serenity. Dogs barked playfully as they chased frisbees, and an occasional cyclist rang their bell, weaving effortlessly through the meandering path. Near a large weathered oak tree stood an old wooden bench, its paint worn from years of sun and rain. Sitting on it was a lone woman, her presence unobtrusive yet quietly commanding. She appeared to belong to the park itself, calm, natural, and rooted. Her posture was relaxed, one arm resting casually along the back of the bench, the other holding a small protein bar, which she slowly broke into pieces and scattered at her feet. A cluster of pigeons eagerly pecked at the crumbs, their heads bobbing in rhythmic hunger. She watched them with a quiet, meditative stillness, her lips pressed into a neutral line, neither smiling nor frowning. Ronda Rousey. There was an elemental power within her stillness, forged through years of battle, discipline, and resilience. Clad in black athletic leggings and a simple gray hoodie, her body was sculpted from a lifetime of combat sports. Her blonde hair, pulled back in a tight ponytail, framed sharp cheekbones, piercing eyes, and a jawline that spoke of unwavering resolve. She radiated a calm that only came from someone who had faced storms and learned to stand unmoved within them. Beneath that calm, a quiet tension hinted at a dormant force, ever present, though she sought only peace in this rare moment away from the cameras and the crowd. The tranquility shattered as Officer Brent Carlile's footsteps broke the natural rhythm of the park. The thud of his polished boots against the pavement carried the weight of authority, a presence that expected obedience. A towering figure in a crisp LAPD uniform, Carlile moved through the park like a predator surveying its domain. His mirrored sunglasses concealed sharp, appraising eyes, and his utility belt, heavy with the instruments of his authority, clinked faintly with each step. As he patrolled the park, his eyes swept over the crowd, cataloging them as non-threats. Then his gaze settled on her. A lone woman sat on a weathered wooden bench beneath a large oak tree. She wasn't doing anything unlawful, but something about her stillness felt off, too self-contained. She wasn't jogging, playing with a dog, chatting with friends, or staring at a phone. She was simply sitting. Stillness without purpose unsettled Carlile. In his world, people who loitered were either waiting for trouble or inviting it. His lips curled slightly in quiet disdain. He had encountered her type before. People who carried themselves with a stubborn, unshakable self-assurance, as if authority was something that applied only to others. The kind who resisted, who challenged, who believed the rules were beneath them. Carlile enjoyed correcting people like that. In his mind, it was a public service. Veering off the main path, he adjusted his course directly toward the bench. His boots struck the ground with deliberate purpose, the kind of stride that announced his presence long before his voice ever needed to. As he closed the distance, his fingers brushed against the handle of his baton, the solid weight of it familiar and reassuring. He didn't expect trouble, but if trouble presented itself, he welcomed the opportunity to remind someone exactly who was in charge. The world around them continued its peaceful rhythms. A woman walking her dog slowed briefly, her eyes flicking between the officer and the solitary woman on the bench, sensing something unspoken just beneath the surface. A group of young men playing catch nearby exchanged knowing glances, their movements slowing as they recognized the telltale prelude to a confrontation. Carlile's shadow stretched long over the bench as he came to a halt. The woman, however, remained unmoved. A flicker of irritation crossed Carlyle's otherwise controlled expression. He was used to people adjusting themselves the moment he arrived. Nervous shifts, quick explanations, immediate compliance. But this woman did nothing. No recognition, no apology, no obedience. The air between them thickened, the surrounding sounds of the park seeming to muffle under the weight of the unspoken challenge. For a long, slow breath, time itself felt suspended. Carlile inhaled, his nostrils flaring as he suppressed the frustration creeping beneath his skin. This was the part where people realized who they were dealing with and responded accordingly. Yet she remained still, as if his presence was nothing more than an afterthought. The silence, he decided, would not last. He shifted his stance, his polished boots grinding subtly against the pavement. The fingers of his right hand flexed once, brushing against the handle of his baton. A habitual movement born not out of necessity, but out of anticipation. He didn't enjoy escalating situations without reason, but he never hesitated when an opportunity presented itself. The sun continued its slow descent, stretching the shadows across the park. The golden warmth of the day faded, giving way to the creeping edge of twilight. Yet within the small circle where they stood, one seated, one standing, the air remained thick with something unseen but inevitable. Carlyle's patience, always a thin and brittle veneer, cracked. The woman's refusal to acknowledge him, to submit to the silent authority he carried in his uniform, gnawed at him like a splinter beneath the skin. He was used to a world where people responded, where they flinched, apologized, obeyed. Yet this woman remained motionless, her calm so absolute it felt like defiance. His boots struck the pavement with sharp finality as he stepped closer. A faint scuffing sound accompanied his movement, the whisper of polished leather against stone. His shadow deepened, fully eclipsing the seated figure. Still, she did not move. The silence pressed in, unbearable. Carlyle's jaw tensed, his irritation smoldering beneath the surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was clipped and cold, sharp enough to slice through the park's tranquil ambiance. He expected the usual responses, the nervous excuses, the quick apologies that came from those caught beneath the crushing weight of his presence. Yet there was nothing, not a word, not even a glance. The gout was done. An unawares glance. A muscle in his jaw ticked, the only visible sign of his growing agitation. Her stillness felt like something more than ignorance. It felt like dismissal, and that was something he could not allow. Carlyle's authority thrived on reaction. People flinched, obeyed, and submitted. But now control was slipping, faster than he could grasp. Control was established in moments exactly like this, when defiance met force and force prevailed. Carlile felt the familiar warmth of adrenaline seep into his veins, a slow, simmering heat beneath his skin. His hand, moving almost of its own accord, brushed against the baton at his side, the cool, textured grip a reassuring anchor. His voice, low and edged with warning, sliced through the shrinking distance between them. Still, no response. His irritation sharpened into something colder, something that scraped against his ribs and coiled in his chest. This wasn't defiance, it was indifference, and in Carlyle's world, indifference was a challenge. Without another word, he moved. The baton sliced downward, a sharp, practiced motion designed to correct, to punish. Yet it struck nothing but air. At the last possible moment, the woman shifted, not with haste, not with panic, but with the effortless grace of someone who had lived their entire life in motion. The baton passed within an inch of her form, and the force of the strike met only wood. The bench trembled under the impact, the sharp crack of splintering wood echoing through the air. Carlyle's eyes flickered with confusion. His strike had been fast, precise. It should have landed. His mind registered the miss, but his body, driven by instinct, by pride, pressed forward. With a twist of his wrist, he redirected the baton into a backhanded arc, this time aiming lower, targeting her torso. The second blow never landed. Her arm rose, smooth, effortless. The baton stopped mid-swing, arrested in her grip. Her hand, strong and steady, closed around the shaft of the weapon with the ease of someone plucking a falling leaf from the air. Carlile felt the impact, not as resistance, but as stillness. Absolute, immovable, and complete. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to pause. Her grip was solid. Too solid. The strength he felt in her fingers was wrong, too controlled, too effortless. The air between them thickened with something primal, a current that needed no words to convey its message. You have made a mistake. Carlyle's instincts screamed at him to pull back, to regain distance, to reassess, but pride moved his muscles before reason reached them. He yanked hard, intending to rip the baton from her grasp, but the baton did not move. She did. Her arm twisted, not violently, but with precise mechanical intent. Carlile felt his wrist turn unnaturally, tendons protesting as the weapon rotated under her control. He had a moment, a brief, fleeting instant where his body told him the truth before his mind could catch up. The baton was no longer his. Not wrestled away, just gone, simply taken. The polished shaft hit the ground between them with a sharp, ringing clatter, rolling once before coming to a rest against the pavement. The silence that followed was a living thing. A small audience had gathered, an older woman clutching a dog's leash, a pair of young men frozen mid-step, a couple standing hand in hand. Their eyes were wide, their expressions locked somewhere between disbelief and anticipation. Some had already raised their phones, their screens glowing as they captured the impossible moment. Carlyle's breath came sharp and uneven, his chest rising and falling in a clipped rhythm. His arm tingled, not from pain but from the unfamiliar loss of leverage. The physical sting of defeat was minor compared to the weight pressing against his ribs, suffocating, inescapable. He had moved first, he had struck first, and he had failed. She had taken his baton, and now she discarded it. Ronda Rousey remained seated, her expression unreadable. She did not rise, did not advance, did not taunt. She simply let go of the weapon, allowing it to fall to the pavement like something irrelevant, something beneath her notice. Carlyle's ears burned. The pulse in his neck thudded like a war drum, hot and relentless. He felt the weight of the eyes on him, the cameras, the judgment. Shame crawled beneath his skin, raw and venomous. This was not how it was supposed to go. He squared his stance, his body taut, his pride wounded and exposed. The crowd watched, waiting, expecting. His authority, his control, now dangled by a fragile thread, and he knew only one way to seize it back. The baton was gone, but his belt held another answer. His fingers twitched once, brushing against the cold, familiar weight of his service weapon. The moment they made contact, a flicker of uncertainty passed through his chest, a hesitation, thin and fleeting. The woman had not run, had not flinched, had not struck, yet the air between them was charged, thick with something raw and electric. It was the kind of moment that split a life into before and after, the kind where the next decision, the next breath, could change everything. The ground beneath Carlyle's feet felt unsteady, the path ahead blurred by the haze of adrenaline and wounded pride. The laughter of children echoed somewhere in the distance, blissfully unaware of the line that had just been crossed. Though no word had been spoken, the woman's silence screamed louder than any warning. The storm was no longer coming, it was already here. The sharp clatter of the fallen baton still echoed in the air, but it was the silence that followed that carried the heaviest blow. Carlile stood rigid, his breath shallow, uneven. His wrist throbbed, the nerves still singing from the brief, absolute grip that had disarmed him. It wasn't pain that burned through his veins, but humiliation. The eyes, the cameras, the judgment. He felt their weight like a brand searing into his skin. His authority, his power, under scrutiny, undermined. And worse, it had been done without a word, without a blow, without force. The kind of power Ronda Rousey wielded against him could not be taught, it could only be earned. She hadn't even stood up. Carlile's blood pounded in his ears, hot and suffocating. This was not just a failure, it was a reckoning. He could barely hear the murmurs rising from the small gathering crowd, but he saw their faces, the glint of phone cameras capturing every humiliating second. Beneath the heat of his wounded pride, something cold and sharp twisted in his gut. He acted before thinking, before reason could intervene. He reached for his last resort. A desperate hunger to reclaim control drove his fingers toward his belt. His palm found the holster, his thumb flicking the strap free with a mechanical snap. The weight of the firearm, cold and familiar, pressed into his hand. But he never completed the draw. Her hand was already on him. She moved like water, smooth, unhurried, as if the air itself parted to make way for her motion. His wrist, his gun hand, was caught in an unyielding grasp, firm, precise, controlled. The touch of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering violence. His muscles locked in reflexive resistance, but it was too late. His grip, once unshakable, began to slip. The firearm, the ultimate symbol of his power, was no longer his. One moment the gun was his, the next it wasn't, and then it was gone. The gun, heavy with the weight of authority and destruction, now rested effortlessly in her calloused palm. She didn't raise it, didn't point it. She merely held it, turning it slightly, examining its weight with idle curiosity, like an object she had no use for. The silence around them deepened into something unnatural. The murmurs of the crowd faltered, replaced by a collective intake of breath. A sharp, fragile stillness settled over the space, as if the very balance of power had tipped and shattered. Carlile felt the shape of his failure as clearly as he once felt the grip of the weapon in his hand. His body, rigid with adrenaline and confusion, screamed for action, for retaliation, for something to break this unbearable moment where he stood stripped of his power, his tools, and his control. But she didn't move. She didn't threaten. She didn't speak. With deliberate slowness, she bent her knees, lowered the weapon, and placed it on the ground beside the fallen baton. The metal met the pavement with a soft, anticlimactic clink. Then she straightened, resumed her seat, as if nothing had happened. The crowd's murmurs swelled into something heavier, something buzzing with disbelief. More phones were raised, screens capturing his disgrace from every possible angle. Someone whispered, someone chuckled, and Carlile felt something in his chest snap. This wasn't defiance, it was dismissal, and that he could not accept. The sharp, burning heat of his pride flooded through his limbs, scorching over the warning instincts clawing at the edges of his reason. His body moved before his mind could stop it. He surged forward, raw, reckless, burning with the need to reassert what had been stripped from him. It was a charge, unguarded, uncalculated, driven by nothing but fury and desperation. But desperation has no discipline, and the woman met his chaos with absolute precision. There was no strike, no punch, no kick, just a shift. Carlile's body surged forward, driven by instinct and raw desperation, but his momentum met an immovable force. Iron wrapped in velvet grace. His wrist, the same wrist that had lost the baton, lost the gun, lost control, was taken again, not seized, not twisted, simply redirected. His balance vanished. The authority once planted firmly beneath his feet was gone. The earth abandoned him. For a fleeting, breathless moment he was weightless, suspended in a world that no longer answered to him. The sky, brilliant and blue, filled his vision. Then gravity reclaimed him. The impact was sudden, but it was not violence. It was inevitability. His back met the pavement with a hollow, decisive thump that reverberated not through his bones, but through his pride. The air fled his lungs in a sharp, shuddering gasp. The world blurred at the edges, spinning in silent mockery of the man who, only moments ago, had stood certain of his dominion, and then he lay still. Around him, the atmosphere swelled into something new, not just surprise, but recognition. The crowd had not witnessed a fight. They had witnessed a lesson. Carlile's chest heaved, his body burned, not from injury but from the unbearable insult of being reduced, dismantled, without force, without struggle, without even the dignity of acknowledgement. Above him the woman remained seated, still, composed, watching without judgment. There was no triumph in her gaze, no cruelty, no satisfaction. Only the still, patient presence of someone who had been here before. And in that gaze, Carlile felt something colder than any humiliation. She had held back. His fists clenched against the pavement, nails biting into his palms, his breath ragged as the inferno of his failure consumed him. The tension in his chest was unbearable, too sharp, too heavy, too public. The phones were still on him, the faces, the eyes, the judgment. But worse was the silence. The woman didn't need to speak. The world had already heard her loud and clear. Carlile, drowning in the fire of his own collapse, refused to be ended this way. He wouldn't allow it. The anger, the pride, the authority all screamed for an answer, for a conclusion. His hand, shaking but determined, began to move. The gun lay discarded, the baton forgotten, but his belt held more than weapons. It held his voice. His fingers curled around the cold, metallic curve of his radio. He pressed the button. "Officer needs assistance. Immediate backup." His voice, ragged and tight with anger, slashed through the silence. Instantly the air changed. The raw, electric tension snapped into something heavier. The eyes in the crowd flickered with uncertainty, widening as they exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, the woman's expression shifted, not to fear, not to worry, but something colder, a look that said, "You've made your choice." And then, faint but growing, the distant wail of sirens threaded through the summer air. A thin, rising note of tension that promised swift consequences. The park, once a haven of careless joy, now felt taut and watchful, its natural rhythm disrupted by an undercurrent of conflict. People who had paused to observe the unfolding scene no longer wore expressions of idle curiosity. They watched with bated breath, their eyes flicking between the woman and the man on the pavement. They sensed it, the shift, the way this confrontation had outgrown the small stage of a park bench and spilled into something much more dangerous. Carlile lay on the pavement, the heat of the sun pressing into his back, but it wasn't the sun that burned him, it was the weight of his own mistake. His fingers clenched around the radio, its sharp edges digging into his palm like an anchor in a shifting tide. The distant wail of sirens, growing clearer with every passing second, was both a bomb and a curse. Backup meant witnesses, more eyes, more judgment, but it also meant an opportunity. One last chance to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative. He could not be the officer who had been disarmed, thrown down like a fool. No, he would emerge as the one who had subdued a threat. If only there had been a threat. The woman had not moved. She remained seated, untouched by the chaos unfolding around her. The same figure of unshakable composure she had been from the beginning. Her stillness, so effortless, felt like an accusation. She had shown neither aggression nor apology. She had given him nothing to leverage. And yet, he had lost. The sirens closed in. His final chance to shift the tide was slipping through his fingers. Carlile's body screamed with tension as he rolled onto his side, forcing himself to his knees. His limbs ached, but the pain barely registered beneath the crushing weight of disgrace. The murmurs of the crowd pricked at his ears, a soft, uncertain chorus. They were waiting, watching, expecting. His hand hovered near his belt, but the familiar weight of his service weapon was gone. His fingers curled around empty air, his powers stripped away, leaving nothing but the echo of his authority, hollow and meaningless. But he would not be powerless, not here. Not now. His voice sharp, edged with wounded pride, sliced through the thick air. Down on the ground. Now. The command was hard, absolute, a final attempt to frame the story on his terms. It did not matter that the woman had made no move against him. It did not matter that he had struck first, that he had escalated. Authority was not about truth, it was about control. The woman's eyes, cold and clear as a winter sky, locked onto his. For the first time, he felt something deeper than resistance, something more final than refusal. An unspoken question hung in the air. Is this truly the path you choose? She did not lower herself, she did not rise, she simply existed in a space beyond his authority. The sirens arrived, breaking the moment with a sharp screech of tires against pavement. A patrol car rolled onto the grass, its flashing lights painting the park in frantic pulses of red and blue. 2 doors opened in near unison and 2 officers emerged. One was young, rigid with tension, his eyes alert, his stance tight. The other was older, seasoned, his face lined with years of decisions made and consequences borne. His hand rested near his belt, but not on his weapon. With a single sweeping glance, the older officer took in the scene. His gaze landed on Carlile, disheveled, humiliated, his hand twitching near his hip, then on the woman, still, unthreatening, unchanged. Finally, his eyes rested on the scattered weapons, the baton, the firearm, discarded, like relics of a story already told. The younger officer stepped forward, eager, tense, his voice rising. "Ma'am, hands where we can see them!" But before he could take another step, the older officer's hand, firm and certain, halted him. "Wait." His voice was low, but it carried the weight of experience, the kind of authority that didn't need to be forced. His eyes narrowed slightly as the gears of understanding turned behind them. He had seen violence before, he had seen resistance, but this was neither. This was something different. Carlile, sensing his control slipping further, seized the moment with desperation. Both hands shaking, Carlile pointed a trembling finger toward the woman, his voice raw and desperate. "She assaulted an officer. She—" The words, sharp and loud, were meant to fill the space where his authority had fractured, a last gasping attempt to reframe the moment, to make her the villain, to salvage what little control he had left. But the older officer, his eyes never leaving the seated woman, spoke a single word. "No." The syllable fell like a hammer, shattering the fragile framework Carlile had tried to build around his own failure. His face twisted, flushed with anger and something dangerously close to fear. "What do you mean, no? You saw—" "I saw," the senior officer interrupted, his tone even, his gaze heavy. "I saw everything I needed to." His eyes flicked once more to the discarded gun, then back to the woman. And in his expression something shifted. Not just recognition of what she had done, but of who she was. Carlile felt the world tilt beneath him, his heart pounding, his body vibrating with the electric urge to fight, to claw back what was slipping through his fingers. The eyes of the crowd, the judgment of his peers, the searing heat of his own failure pressed against him, suffocating, inescapable. His hand trembled with the need to act, to lash out, to do something, but as it began to rise, the older officer's voice cut through the moment. Calm, but unmistakably final. "That's enough." The sirens, the whispers, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Carlyle's voice, hoarse with fury, broke the silence. "She—" "That's enough," the senior officer repeated, his voice still steady beneath its command. "Stand down, Carlile." "But, Carlile," his pride a raw wound, his shame a searing flame, felt the last thin thread of his restraint snap. His voice, shaken and desperate, became a demand. "Dan." The use of his first name, spoken low and steady, hit harder than any shouted order. It carried no rank, no command, only the weight of someone who had seen, who had already judged him. And Carlile, his body rigid, his heart pounding, knew, in that moment, this was no mere loss. It was an undoing. Then came the words that sealed it. Give me your badge." The world seemed to narrow to a single point. The unbearable silence that followed swallowed everything. Carlile's face, flushed and burning, froze. Shock, disbelief, and something raw slicing through his chest. His lips parted, but no sound came. The older officer's gaze, steady and cold, did not waver. Badge and gun. The command was absolute, but the judgment? The judgment had already been made. Carlile's hand, stiff and trembling, rose to his chest. His fingers, numb and foreign, found the cold curve of the shield that had once defined him. The weight of it, once a symbol of power, now felt like an anchor dragging him down. For a breath, one long, endless breath, he hesitated. But there was nothing left to fight for. No authority, no power, no story to tell. With a motion that felt like breaking, he unpinned the badge. The metal glinted briefly in the fractured light, a dying ember, and hit the older officer's palm with a hollow sound. The gun followed, its weight surrendered without a fight. And the world, as it always does, moved on. The wind rustled the leaves. A child's laughter, distant and pure, echoed somewhere beyond the trees. And the sun, descending toward the horizon, cast long shadows across the broken remains of pride and power. The older officer, his face hard but not unkind, gave a short nod. "Go home, Dan." Carlile, stripped of everything but the crushing weight of himself, turned and walked away. The park seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding. His steps, once commanding, were now heavy with the ruin of his authority. His boots struck the pavement, but they no longer carried the weight of command. Without the badge, without the gun, his uniform felt like a costume, a hollow shell that no longer belonged to him. The warm summer breeze, which had once carried the soft joy of children's laughter and the whisper of leaves, now felt cold against his burning skin, a silent witness to his disgrace. The eyes of the crowd followed him, some wide with disbelief, others narrowed with judgment. But the worst were the ones still recording, the phones raised, screens capturing every painful second. He could already feel it. This moment would not stay confined to the park. It would spread, carried by likes, by shares, by comments, until it became something bigger than himself. Larger than his failure, it would become a spectacle. His stomach twisted at the thought of it. A lifetime of authority, of power, reduced to a viral clip that the world would dissect and mock. Every moment, every misstep, replayed, shared, commented on. His name would not be spoken with respect, but with ridicule. Yet it wasn't the cameras that scorched his pride the deepest. It was her. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't struck him, hadn't threatened, and yet she had undone him all the same, stripping away every layer of control until only the raw, ugly truth remained. And the truth was this: he had brought himself to ruin step by step, not by her hand, but by his own, driven by the need to dominate someone who had never needed power to be powerful. The senior officer, his face lined with experience and disappointment, watched Carlile's retreat without satisfaction. His grip tightened around the surrendered badge and weapon, their weight heavier than before. This was no victory. This was consequence, heavy, cold, inevitable. With a glance, he gave a subtle nod to the younger officer, who stepped toward the seated woman. But there was no aggression in his movement, no tension in his posture, only caution, the kind that comes from knowing you are in the presence of something you do not fully understand. The woman, still seated, turned her eyes toward him. She did not move, did not shift, did not react in any way that could be read as hostility. Yet, in her stillness, he felt it, the presence of someone who could end a fight before it ever began. He stopped a few paces away. His voice, measured and even, broke the silence. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Her eyes, steady and sharp, held his for a beat. Then, with the same quiet composure she had carried through the entire ordeal, she dipped her chin once, a silent acknowledgement. Nothing more. The officer's hand, which had hovered cautiously near his belt, eased back to his side. There would be no need for force here. There never had been. Would you be willing to stay a moment and make a statement? His tone was respectful, not a command, but a request. The woman's expression remained unreadable. She shifted her gaze briefly to the fallen baton, then to the discarded firearm, before returning to the officer. For a moment it seemed she would refuse, but then, without a word, she stood. The movement, fluid and controlled, seemed to lift the invisible tension from the air. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to disperse. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the ever-present glow of phone screens dimmed. A few lingered, their curiosity still tethered to the gravity of what they had witnessed, but the spectacle, the fire that had drawn their attention, was dying to embers. Carlile's retreat carried him past them, but he did not hear their whispers. His ears roared with the pounding of his own heart. His mind circled the event, desperate, burning. Disbelief clamped down on Carlile like a vice. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms as if pain could anchor him against the unraveling of his world. His mouth tasted of copper, and his lip, he realized distantly, had split when he hit the ground. A voice from behind shattered the storm inside his head. Dan! The weight of his own name, stripped of rank, stripped of authority, halted his steps. Slowly, stiffly, he turned to face the senior officer. His face was a battlefield of pride and bitterness, his chest heaving with something that felt dangerously close to rage. But as he met the older man's gaze, he found neither triumph nor sympathy, only the sober gravity of a man who had seen this fall before. "You need to go home." The words were soft, but they carried the weight of finality. Carlile's breath came shallow and uneven. His hands curled into fists again, but there was nothing left to hold on to. There was no enemy here but himself. His voice, when it came, was raw. "This isn't—" "It is." The senior officer cut through the protest before it could form. "It's over." The truth of it hit harder than any blow. Carlile's jaw worked, his teeth grinding against the bitter taste of defeat. For a moment he simply stood there, a man stripped of everything but his anger and his shame. Then, with a sharp, ragged breath, he turned and walked away. His shadow stretched long and hollow behind him. The park, indifferent to his disgrace, welcomed the return of its peace. Children's laughter rang out once more. The soft murmur of leaves whispered in the evening breeze. Footsteps on gravel resumed their steady rhythm. Yet something had shifted, something unseen, something felt. The earth holds memory, and the ground beneath the old oak would remember this day as one where power had been tested and found wanting. The woman, her face composed but her eyes still guarded, spoke for the first time. Her voice was low but firm. "No charges. He's had enough." The senior officer studied her for a long moment. The hard lines of his face softened, just for a fleeting second. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was understanding. Understood. She gave him a nod, and without another word she turned and began to walk away. Her steps were steady, unhurried, absolute. She did not look back. There was nothing left to see. The confrontation, the humiliation, the fall. It was done. She carried nothing from it, because it had never been her burden to carry. Behind her, the park resumed its rhythms, and somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the echoes of what had been, life continued, as it always does, oblivious to the battles fought and the pride broken beneath the dappled shade of an old oak tree. The park, now washed in the amber hues of the setting sun, seemed to exhale. The breeze carried the soft scent of warm grass and distant blossoms. The chatter of families, the laughter of children, the rhythmic steps of joggers all returned, blending once more into the tranquil symphony of life. And yet, beneath this veneer of normalcy, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, memorizing the weight of what had passed. Ronda Rousey moved with the same steady, effortless grace she had shown from the beginning. Her steps were measured, unhurried. She carried herself away from the clearing, away from the confrontation, away from the crowd that had already begun dissolving back into the folds of their lives. She did not glance behind her. There was no need. The chapter was closed. She had given no threat, made no demand. The phones that had captured every second of Carlile's fall slowly lowered, and with them the murmurs of the onlookers softened. Already, the first videos were scattering through the digital ether, seeds of a story that would bloom and spread far beyond the trees and pathways of the park. But Ronda had no stake in that. She knew that truth was rarely shaped by recordings or headlines. It lived in the bones of those who witnessed it. It lingered in the silence, where words held no power. The senior officer, still clutching Carlile's surrendered badge and weapon, watched her go, his lips pressed into a thin line, the deep lines of his face carved further by the weight of choices made and consequences rendered. He had seen many things in his years behind the badge: anger, violence, injustice, and the bitter echoes of power misused. But this had not been a battle. It had been something colder, something cleaner, a reckoning. His eyes flicked to the crowd, noting the faces, the expressions, a tapestry of reactions ranging from awe to discomfort. Then, with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard, he spoke to the few lingering witnesses. "That's enough. Move along." The simple command, carried on the steady current of his voice, was enough to break whatever spell had bound them there. Conversations trailed off. Footsteps carried people away, and soon the park resumed its normal rhythm. The spectacle faded, slipping into the folds of memory. The phones, though, would tell the story. They always did. But the truth? That was something different, something felt, not filmed. In the distance, Carlile's figure was shrinking, a silhouette against the golden haze of the evening. His steps were rigid, his back straight in a posture that tried to hold together what had already come apart. Yet, with each stride, he walked deeper into something he could not outrun. Pride burns hot enough to blind, but once the fire dies, all that remains is ash. And Carlile had felt the burn. The older officer's grip on the surrendered badge tightened for a moment before he finally released it. He felt no triumph, only the familiar cold weight of consequence. Carlile was not the first to fall, and he would not be the last, but there was a difference between punishment and justice. The former ended with a sentence. The latter lingered, reshaping the world around it. Justice, he knew, had already spoken. At the edge of the park, Ronda Rousey slowed her steps. A few pigeons, bold, indifferent, had returned to the spot where she had sat, pecking lazily at the few remaining crumbs on the pavement. The world, it seemed, had already moved on, and so would she. She had come to the park for peace, and peace in its own way had returned. A child's laughter, light and carefree, carried through the trees. For the first time that day, Ronda allowed a small, fleeting smile to brush her lips. This was the only victory that mattered, not dominance, not power, but the return of something simpler, something far more valuable: stillness. With a final glance at the fading sun, she walked on, her shadow stretching long and steady across the earth behind her. The park remained unchanged, oblivious to the silent collision, not of fists, but of forces older than time itself. And as twilight folded the day into night, the earth, the trees, and the sky bore silent witness to a truth that required no headline to endure. Power is loud, justice is silent, but it always endures. The lesson in this story is that true strength isn't about force or authority, it's about control over oneself. Officer Carlile believed power came from dominance, but Ronda Rousey proved otherwise. Without saying a word, she dismantled his authority, showing that real power comes from composure, discipline, and presence. In life, many mistake aggression for strength, whether in leadership, relationships, or society, but brute force crumbles when faced with quiet confidence. The ability to stay calm under pressure is far more powerful than reacting with anger or intimidation. Carlile's downfall wasn't because of Ronda. It was his own inability to accept limits. Power, when misused, leads to self-destruction. Respect cannot be forced, it must be earned. The takeaway? Power isn't in a badge, a weapon, or a title. It's in how you carry yourself, how you treat others, and how you handle challenges. Strength isn't about defeating others, it's about mastering yourself. And in the end, true power is not in making people fear you, but in making them recognize your presence without needing to raise a hand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating content. Explore our channel for more thrilling stories and unforgettable moments, and be sure to share this video with your friends.